Overview. We've discussed some common behavior problems in dogs and general options for treatment. In this module, you will learn several methods that can be used to decrease problematic behaviors. You will also learn which methods to use first and which to use only as a last resort. As professionals, dog trainers and animal behaviorists are obligated ethically to do the least amount of harm possible in the course of their work. Choosing the least intrusive, minimally aversive procedures, lemma, is the most basic of the dog's trainer's ethical principles. Learning objectives. By the end of this module, students will 1. Describe 8 methods of decreasing behavior. Learning activities. Required reading. B&B Chapter 15 through 18, Donaldson Chapter 3, page 77 through 87, module reading quiz, and journal. Methods of decreasing behavior. The methods discussed in this module were taken from Karen Pryor's book, Don't Shoot the Dog. They are listed here from least to most intrusive/aversive. Professional trainers should always use the least intrusive, minimally aversive procedure first, while balancing the timeliness of the problem. 1. Change the motivation. 2. Shape the absence of the behavior. 3. Put the behavior on cue. 4. Train an incompatible behavior. 5. Extinction. 6. Negative reinforcement. 7. Punishment. 8. Shoot the animal. Most of these should sound familiar already. We will discuss each in turn and provide examples for how they can be used. Change the motivation. This is the least intrusive method and the one I use most often. Once the underlying motivation for the behavior is identified, we can alter the motivation by changing the environment. For example, if a dog is destroying items in the home due to boredom, we can reduce the boredom. To do this, use activity feeders so that the dog has to work for their food, provide a lot of toys and games for the dogs to engage in, but only allow access to them when the dog is home alone. And provide plenty of exercise to reduce the dog's boredom when home alone. If a dog is aggressive towards men because he is fearful, we work to reduce the fear of men. This is accomplished by commonly using desensitization and counter-conditioning, DSCC. DSCC is also used for separation anxiety treatment. The motivation typically of separation anxiety is a fear of being left alone. Using DSCC, we remove the underlying fear that leads to the problematic behavior. We also reward the dog for calm behavior during steps of the departure routine. Shape the absence of the problem behavior. This technique was used in the last video showing treatment of separation anxiety. The technical term for this method is differential reinforcement of other behavior, or DRO. Differential reinforcement simply means withholding reinforcement for one behavior while providing it to another behavior. DRO is providing reinforcement when the target behavior does not occur during a set time period. In the video of separation anxiety, the set time period varied based on the step of training. There are other differential reinforcement procedures as well, including DRA, differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, and DRI, differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. Training in incompatible behavior is also on our list in this module. Put the behavior on cue. This is a less often used and more complex method for decreasing behaviors. It is an antecedent manipulation that depends on very tight stimulus control. The idea is that if a behavior is only rewarded in the presence of a certain stimulus, cue, then the behavior should never occur without the cue. Essentially, train the behavior so that it occurs after a cue and then don't give the cue. If you never give the cue, the behavior should never occur again. Train an incompatible behavior. This is a simple and effective method that uses differential reinforcement of an incompatible behavior. The problematic behavior is identified, the functional reward is identified, and then an incompatible behavior, physically incompatible with the problem behavior, is chosen and taught. Next, the functional reward is no longer provided following the problem behavior, extinction, but is providing following the incompatible one. For example, if the problem is that a dog begs at the dinner table, jumps on people, whines, etc. to get food, we could train the dog to go to bed. Once he knows this cue, we stop rewarding begging and instead provide food rewards when the dog remains in the go-to-bed position in the presence of food. Of course, we would break this down into smaller steps, but this is the general use of a DRI. Many dogs jump on their owners and guests, especially during greetings. This is an attention-maintained behavior. To use a DRI in this case, we would provide attention only after a sit and never provide attention after the dog jumps. The dog cannot physically sit and jump at the same time, so this is a DRI intervention. Extinction is a common method to decrease behavior, however, it should never be used alone. Extinction is simply not providing a consequence to behavior, no reward or punishment. When using extinction, it is necessary to know what is rewarding behavior so that it can be removed. Remember our function of behavior: attention, escape, tangible, automatic. How would we implement extinction for behaviors maintained by each of these reinforcers? Remember that extinction should not be used alone, but for the sake of understanding what extinction is and how it works, let's think about extinction only for the following journal entry. Negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is probably one of the most confused terms in psychology. Negative reinforcement is the removal of something that increases the likelihood of behavior in the future. In other words, the behavior occurs to avoid or stop something unpleasant. You take aspirin to stop a headache. You put on sunglasses to avoid the bright sunlight hurting your eyes. You open an umbrella to avoid getting wet. Although negative reinforcement and punishment are not technically the same thing, each involves the use of something aversive and therefore have similar negative side effects. The use of a negative reinforcement procedure includes the use of a punisher for the problem behavior. That's why negative reinforcement is near the bottom of our list. It is a more intrusive method of changing behavior that should only be used if necessary and ethical given the situation. So how can we use this as a method to decrease behavior? Here is a personal example. I used to have a cat that loved to sit on my lap in need. This bothered me, so I began spraying her with a water bottle each time she did it. Kneading is followed by a punisher, the water. However, I would not spray her if she would lay on my lap. So she could avoid the unpleasant water by laying down on my lap instead of kneaded. Laying down is reinforced by the avoidance of the water. We use negative reinforcement every time we use the gentle leader head collar for a dog that pulls. When the dog pulls on the leash, the gentle leader gets tight and their face turns their head to the side so that they lose their view ahead of them. How can the dog avoid this unpleasant experience? By not pulling on the leash or walking close to the handler. So pulling is punished by walking near the handler is reinforced by the removal of something unpleasant. Punishment. Remember the difference between the term punishment as used in lay language and the way that we use it when discussing behavior. As you know, punishment is the addition or removal of something to decrease behavior. Positive punishment, SP+, is the last method for decreasing behavior that should be used. SP+ should only be used by someone who is an expert in behavior and only when other methods have failed to work. The use of punishment has been shown to lead to fear and aggression in dogs. The risks of using SP+ should be weighed with the risks that would result if the behavior continues to occur. If the risks of using SP+ are worse, when the behavior should be managed instead. Negative punishment tends to be less benign and intrusive. For example, we may withhold a food reward if a dog performs a command other than the one requested. In some cases, this use of punishment can lead to unwanted side effects, but it is unlikely. However, removal of food in the case of a dog guarding his food using aggression will only make the problem worse. The use of positive punishers such as training/prong collars, physical restraint, and even spray bottles can, and often do, lead to adverse side effects. Therefore, the use of any punishment procedure should be used only when necessary, after thoughtful consideration, and only by an experienced and knowledgeable person. If punishment is chosen as the method of choice, there are several factors that will affect its effectiveness. First, punishment must be delivered immediately after the problem behavior. It also must be delivered after every instance of the problem behavior or on an FR1 schedule. Punishment should only be used for one discrete behavior at a time. Otherwise, the dog will be getting non-contingent punishment, which leads to a host of adverse behavioral problems. Punishment, by definition, decreases behavior, so if you are using an aversive stimulus with no decrease in problem behavior over time, this is not punishment. In this situation, what you are doing is closer to abuse than any scientific punishment procedure. The use of punishment almost always teaches the dog how to avoid it. So instead of teaching the dog what to do, it merely teaches the dog when and what not to do. Often, in the process of punishment, dogs learn to look for the source, i.e. the spray bottle or the shot collar. If the source is not present, the dog will engage in the behavior because they have learned that punishment only follows if the source is present. This is not helpful when the goal is behavior modification, or even worse, the dog avoids the person applying the punisher altogether. Develops behavior to keep the person away from them, aggression. The use of punishment is also dangerous for the person applying it. not only because the dog may aggress towards them, but also because it often works, and works well at quickly eliminating behavior problems. This is rewarding to the person using it, who will then be more likely to choose punishment for the next behavior problem, whether appropriate or not. A client of mine 5 years ago recently called me because the same dog had become unpredictably aggressive. In our work 5 years ago, we used a shock collar to train the dog a reliable recall. We did this as a last resort after considering the risks without a reliable recall, getting hit by a car, and the increased quality of life the dog could experience if he had a recall, off-leash play, and hikes. We did everything right as far as using all positive to train a recall on a long line first, generalized the recall to outside on a long line, and gradually added distractions. The problem was with other dogs and animals. The dog would not come back to the owner for any reward we could offer in these situations, so we used a shock collar. Anyway, 5 years later, the dog is going after and biting the owner seemingly randomly. After much investigation and probing, the owners admitted to using the shock collar randomly throughout the house for all kinds of little behaviors they didn't like. They shocked him for getting close to the grill when they were cooking, for lying near the kitchen table, for going into a part of the yard with flowers, etc. The unpredictable aggression was caused by the unpredictable shock the dog had been exposed to for the last several years. The fact that the dog handled the level of abuse for so long without becoming aggressive still amazes me. Ideally, if punishment is used, the dog is taught and rewarded for a replacement behavior. The punisher occurs immediately every time the behavior occurs, and the punisher is strong enough to reduce the behavior's occurrence, but not too strong to cause damaging emotional effects or behavioral concerns. The punisher should only be used a handful of times. If it is not effective after a handful of applications, it should no longer be used. Shoot the animal. In its most extreme form, this method of decreasing problem behavior means euthanasia or surgical removal of organs such as vocal cords or barking issues. At times, euthanasia is the best option for the dog, and this is something that professionals may recommend depending on the situation. Obviously, this is the very last resort for most dogs. One method not listed here, medication, is an option that is typically attempted prior to euthanasia. In its milder form, shooting the animal refers to other antecedent manipulations or simply managing the problem behavior so that it cannot occur. For example, if a dog is aggressive to other dogs, do not take him or her near the other dogs. If the trigger is never present, the behavior won't occur. In some cases, rehoming can be an option. If a dog is aggressive towards children, it may be rehomed to a family with no kids successfully. For house training issues, the first step is preventing accidents by kennel training or otherwise restraining the dog while inside the home. These milder forms of management are often used in conjunction with other methods to decrease behaviors. In fact, many of the methods we've discussed in the module are used in combination, depending on the problem behaviors of concern.